check, 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 check. All right, let's get you mic'd up here. Check, 1, 2, 2, 2.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like to ask mushroom people, what's your sort of gateway mushroom? And that's a good one to know because it gives you an insight into like when, where, what season people got into a mushroom. I think in my current, and there's a picture of it in my talk. I might forget to actually talk about it, so I'll mention it now. My gateway mushroom for like my current mushroom obsession happened when I was in New Zealand, and I ran into. At the time it was called a Grosbeak parasitica. Now I think it's like cyclocide parasitic or something like that. But it's this big, it looks like a giant piopini, basically, if you've seen one of those, kind of a velvety brown. And I started finding that in New Zealand and was like, holy shit, what is this? It's really cool. And after I'd found it a few times, I was like, I wonder if I can eat this. And so I got it identified, and that was sort of the first like edible mushroom that I, on my own, kind of, not on my own, but like, with the resources available to me on the internet and stuff like that, I figured out how to eat it, and that sparked a kind of an obsession for me. Yeah. I mean, I think mushroom people understand that decently well. Okay, let me get my mic on, and then we're gonna get rolling. Oop. Mute this again. Okay, am I going to deafen you guys if I talk at a normal volume? Okay, cool. Oh, yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 25th annual Fungus Fair. Is this anyone's first time here? All right, welcome. Today is our annual party, all things fungi. So I hope you guys check out the vendors. There's some art, food, and a lot of educational information, and 101, which is the room directly across the way. Dr. Gordon Walker.
Sorry, apparently I can't move in this thing without making noise.
Yeah, maybe put it in a different pocket.
Okay, I can do that.
To us
All right.
from
Well,
Just put it in its back pocket.
okay, great. Let's do that.
Dr. Gordon Walker comes to us from the Sonoma Mycological Association, which is a really cool club in the Bay Area, our friends up north. California is one of the cool places because we have 7 or 8, 9 clubs here in California, which is really cool. A lot of other states only have 1. So we're really excited to have you come travel down to check us out, and everyone give them a round of applause.
Hey guys, thank you for having me. I live in Napa, but I am part of the Sonoma Mycology Association. And I think the Bay Area has like 5 clubs on its own, so there might be even more than 9 clubs in all of California, but it's pretty cool to like come down to San Diego. I took this trip as an opportunity to come see my buddy who was down here and then also get to see you guys. So I love this piece of art. This was the first thing I ever had commissioned as a logo. I found a college student who had made, do you guys know what Arcambolo faces are? So it was a guy who made faces out of fruit as still life kind of thing. He was like a Dutch painter way back when. And there was a student who'd done a face out of whales. He's a marine biology student, and he did the whole cetacea face. And I was like, that's super cool, dude. Would you be able to do one with mushrooms? And he was like, maybe, but I don't know anything about mushrooms. And I was like, great, I got you. So I sat down in like sort of a haze and like creative fury and like sketched out this like really shitty version of a face with, Amanita head and Mycena eyes and stuff like that, and kind of labeled everything and sent it off to him. and he asked me for a picture of myself, and I sent him this sort of like, it's a 3/4 view of me holding a maitake. I was really excited in New Jersey, and that was kind of what he turned into this. And some people have described this as like a nightmarish face, and they hate looking at it, but I think most mushroom people are like, that's kind of cool. I fall on the cool side, and it was just sort of my first foray into like creating art in collaboration with an artist, and sort of like saying, I'm going to take my mushroom knowledge and then like take your art skills and kind of do this. And I took portfolio art. I'm capable of art. I'm just lazy and I didn't want to do it. And I wanted to like give a college student some money to like make something cool that was not in a style that I could produce. So that's that. So I think earlier about 3 people raised their hands when I asked if they knew what Fascinated by Fungi was. I don't know if there's anyone else who's familiar with my stuff, but okay, cool, there you go. So I started originally with an Instagram, and then that snowballed into like a TikTok and a YouTube and a Facebook, and I'm smeared all over social media, sometimes spread too thin. But you know, the main goal has just been to kind of put more mushroom media out there, because I think when I first started getting interested, the only media that was really available was the incumbent stuff from Paul Stamets, and it didn't always sit right with me, so I was like, maybe I can do my version of this, and that's kind of what I've been doing. And I'm on every single one of those platforms and more. You can find all those things. So you asked earlier, origins of Fascinated by Fungi, how did I get kind of fascinated? And there was a lot of stuff that went into it, sort of a rich tapestry of lifetime experiences, but really I just had some stuff as a kid that kind of inspired me. And my path through life is grew up in Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts, if anyone's familiar with that. My dad's a professor at MIT, so I kind of grew up in the realm of academia. But I went to UC Santa Cruz for undergrad, which is great. Did a lot of sailing, a lot of scuba. I then went to UC Davis, as I was inspired while at UC Santa Cruz to get really into homebrewing. And I got really interested in yeast and fermentation. And so I went to UC Davis and kind of like tucked into the food science and sensory science, and specifically like fermentation science, biochemistry stuff. Did a PhD there where I worked on wine yeast and interactions between yeast and bacteria, and how that was sort of like microbial ecology of wine fermentations, which was interesting, but at the time I didn't realize how relevant it would be to like my interest later as I got into mushrooms, because suddenly then I was thinking about like ecological interactions on this like mega scale, like what was micro was now mega, and then thinking about these massively complex webs of the ways that things are kind of talking to each other in nature. And also the fact that like throughout most of scientific history, all we've ever done is like isolate one thing and study it, and you're like, yeah, but nothing in nature really exists in isolation, so does it make sense to isolate stuff and study it, how it looks on its own? Like, if we took one of us and popped us in a cage for 20 years, would we be acting like a normal human being? Probably not. You know, our physiological functions might be somewhat normal, but our mental stuff would be pew. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about when we think about fungi. So after my time at Davis, I worked at Opus One, which is a very fancy winery in Napa, and moved to Napa. Then I started doing Bay Area biotech sales and going into companies like Possible Foods, but also like Bayer, like big pharmaceutical, big food tech, lots of startups, things like that. So I got a cool sampling of all the different things happening, places that are making mycomaterials like MycoWorks, et cetera. And then during the pandemic, everything kind of just fell apart, and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna just concentrate on teaching people about mushrooms. So that's what I'm doing now. Thanks. So I sort of started this current mushroom obsession while I was living in New Zealand. It was after I'd finished Davis and had done one harvest at Opus One, and I went to New Zealand with a partner. They were working, and I ended up just like, was supposed to be writing papers, but I got bored and was like, I'm gonna go for hikes, and I started finding mushrooms. And after I had several hundred mushroom photos on my phone, I was like, I can't keep spamming my normal Instagram friends. I'm gonna start like a mushroom-specific Instagram. And right away, I started seeing feedback. I'd get like, you know, 200-300 likes on a post, and I was like, whoa, this is insane. I've never had more than like 15 people press that like button on a normal post. And it was a really wet year. There were sort of typhoons coming in, and I was just getting soaked, but every time I went out, I was like, it's really cool to find stuff. And it was engaging to post that stuff in a forum where people were able to respond to it. And I realized very quickly that I was like learning from people, because the original purpose of my social media was to kind of like document, almost like a journal, say, hey, here's what I found, here's my best guess. But the feedback I was getting was teaching me a lot, and I was learning fairly quickly too that the work I'd done in my PhD, where I had to spend 7 years translating my science for winemakers and vice versa, my winemaking for scientists, I got pretty good at kind of science communication. And so in writing the descriptions for mushroom stuff, I was able to, not just like repeat exactly what one other person had said. I'd go check a couple of different sources. It's not usually anything that crazy. I'll check Wikipedia, I'll check Mushroom Expert. Sometimes I'll dive into the primary literature just a little bit to see, what are the interesting tidbits about a mushroom. And then kind of like, coalesce that into like 1 or 2 paragraphs and post it. And usually there's a bunch of typos and I'll fix them later. But that's kind of like how social media started. And I was very lucky too that I had online resources like iNaturalist, because I think a lot of people are like, oh, I can't go into nature, it's too scary. And I'm like, well, I felt the same way. Like I remember in grad school, people were like, we're gonna go to Salt Point and go mushroom hunting. And I was like, well, I'm not getting up at 4 in the morning, so have fun with that. But I was like, I don't feel confident to go out on my own and actually look for stuff because, like, oh, I'm gonna kill myself or something like that. And you're like, no, you're not. You can go out and look at all the mushrooms you want, take all the pictures you want, touch everything you want. You're not gonna hurt yourself. But having a tool like iNaturalist, which allows you to, I don't know where my phone is. Oh, phone's right there. You take a picture and then immediately upload it and get back feedback on what, it's not always right. Sometimes you'll upload like a jelly fungus and it'll be like, this is a sponge. And you're like, no, it's not, it's fungi. But at least you have access to this community and the people around you. And that's been amazing because I am self-taught, but I would never pretend that I learned things in a vacuum. This has been an incredible like community experience that's been brought together by mushrooms. So definitely had a lot of help, guidance, advice coming to events like this, and just learning from people has been like the best way to kind of like become a mycologist. I still hesitate to call myself a mycologist because I've had no formal training, but I think in the world of mycology, that's kind of the great thing about it, is that the bar for entry is so low that really anyone can be a mycologist, and that's one of the things I love to like come to a talk and try to convince people who like don't feel confident in their own abilities that they can absolutely be a impactful and meaningful mycologist within their lifetime by just, reading and learning and, getting into the science a little bit. It's really not that hard, and there's people all the time who make major contributions to our field without actually having like a formal education. If you guys have ever seen like Alan Rockefeller talk, like he doesn't have the degrees, but he's clearly like incredibly smart, focused, motivated. In fact, many ways, like I hang out with Alan, I'm like, man, I have a PhD, but like you know a lot more than I do about any of these things, because he spends all of his time working on it and thinking about it. So currently I've got over like 2 million followers, which is kind of a mind-blowing thing. Most of them are on TikTok, but they're very international too, and that's one of the things I take great joy in, is that like I look at my stats and I'm something like 30–40% of my followers in the US, and almost everyone else is international, and that really spaces out like the way that people are looking at mushrooms around the world. And to me too, I see comments or like posts that have like 10 million views and 100,000 likes or something like that, and I'm like, all the comments, regardless of what language they're in, are pretty much the same stuff. People have the same kinds of reactions to mushrooms worldwide, and that is also really exciting. So I mentioned earlier my gateway mushroom in New Zealand I saw was Colossae parasitica, or Grossae parasitica. That's what that is. It's basically like a giant Piapini mushroom. It's really good. This is another interesting one that really caught my eye in New Zealand. I think this, if you scroll all the way back on my Instagram, this was like my very first Instagram post was this mushroom, because I was captivated by it. It was like a beautiful little like orange poor conch kind of thing. Tiny little ones all over decaying wood in New Zealand. I was like, these are beautiful. And someone was like, yeah, they are beautiful, but they're also invasive. They're from South Africa, and they're displacing a lot of like the little wood rot fungi in New Zealand and other subtropical areas. So that was another lesson. It was like, here's something really beautiful, but also like there's ecology you have to think about, and there's many layers of nuance within mushrooms. And as we think about that, I think it's kind of a thing to keep in mind. And I'm just grateful to be here talking to you guys. So let's jump into this. So what's a mushroom? You guys know what a mushroom is? Specifically? I like to define it basically, it's the reproductive structure of mycelium. With that in mind, there's a lot of things like molds make reproductive structures. There's the actual definition of a mushroom gets a little fuzzy when we start getting down to all the different kinds of fungi and their reproductive structures. Generally, I'll count anything that even a weird crust or whatever as a mushroom. There's a lot of things we call like a fungus, a jelly fungus instead of a jelly mushroom. I'd say that most of those things are still mushrooms as long as you meet the criteria of being a reproductive structure and producing spores, at least sexual spores. And that's another thing, that mushrooms produce asexual spores and sexual spores, is they can exist in like a haploid form where they only have one copy of their genome and look totally different than they do when they have 2 copies of their genome. I'll go into that later. But it's still like, even mycologists will argue about like what a mushroom is. So if you're confused, don't worry about it because so are mycologists. But the sort of the basic thing I would say is that the point of a mushroom is essentially to produce those sexual spores and then perpetuate the mycelium. And the point of doing like asexual versus sexual is that the sexual reproduction, you kind of like jingle up the dice a little bit of your genome and like try a new combo, so you're ideally adapting to new situations, where the asexual spores are like doubling down on where you are right now. So it's kind of the idea. What is mycelium versus mushroom? Because again, this is a big disparity that people don't always understand, specifically online when they see me picking mushrooms and people are like, you're killing the mushroom. And I'm like, no, it's fine. A mushroom is just this temporary reproductive structure. So mycelium is really like the body of a fungus. That is this sort of amorphous, white, growing, fuzzy hair stuff that's in the soil, it's in the wood, it's in whatever the substrate is. Mycelium is a really interesting way of life, and I love this quote from Marilyn Sheldrake's Entangled Life. Who here has read that book? It's a great book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It is a little long and a little verbose and a little lyrical. Merlin is incredible at that, but I can also understand maybe reading it in chunks if you don't want to kind of read an entire book about lyrical mushroom stuff. But he makes this point that mycelium, we as humans are finite. We have a head, we have toes, we have fingers. We kind of know where the boundaries of our body are, and unless you take a lot of mushrooms, you usually know where your boundaries are. Mycelium is kind of the opposite. It is plurality incarnate. Every single little growing tip of that mycelium is essentially the equivalent of a mushroom brain. It's making decisions about which way to grow, how fast to grow. It's sensing its environment, its temperature, its humidity, its nutrients, competition, all sorts of stuff like that. And so how do you coordinate a bajillion different little brains all growing in different directions? Because mycelium is able to do that. They're able to grow out in all these different directions and say, oh, actually over here is food, let's all grow over here. And so they can coordinate all these different things. And it's bizarre because they don't have a nervous system, they don't have a brain, they don't have any tissues the way that we do. Mycelium, for the most part, is pretty homogeneous in the sense that it's not differentiated into a lot of different tissues the way that a human body would be. Mushrooms are the opposite, though. They are discrete. They generally have a defined shape, a structure, a body plan. And I just think it's so cool that something that is sort of completely unformed and lives its entire life as this hidden cryptic thing can suddenly produce these discrete little beautiful fruiting bodies that are just there to kind of reproduce in this temporary fashion. So that's, for me, that's a little bit of the difference in mycelium versus a mushroom. So zooming in on this, we have mushroom is made of mycelium, which is made of hyphae, which are little tubular cells. And then within a hypha, it's composed of a phospholipid bilayer with a sort of structured cell wall on top of that. I'll talk about that in a sec. And then I have a picture of that leading hyphal tube. You need to understand what any of those things are, but there's a bunch of proteins and motors and stuff that are moving around in there to make it really dynamic and give it a lot of power and force. Because those hyphae can sneak in between wood. They can get into the carapace of an insect. They can break rock. Lichens that grow on rock are slowly breaking down rock by growing little hyphae into the rock. And then when they absorb water, they swell and make little micro cracks and fissures in the rock. And over many millions of years, we have soil, basically. It's the advent of life on land was because of fungi, I would argue. Mycelium, again, as a thing that is so different from the way that we perceive life, it's living on or in its food. Mycelium, the whole point of it is to essentially, it's not tracking down and eating things the way that we think of animals doing. Instead, it's growing through something and excreting enzymes that start breaking everything else down around it and then kind of absorbing that stuff. And again, that is a very different way of living life than what we think of as animals. So we'll zoom back out, try to put this in context. The pointer you had for me, did the pointer not work too? It'd be really nice to point at the screen. All right, we'll do it this way. So we have 3 domains of life: bacteria, archaea, eukarya. Bacteria and archaea are microscopic, can't see them with the naked eye. Pretty important things. Archaea are usually stuff that lives in extremophile environments, and bacteria are all inside of us and over every single surface. Eukarya is composed of a lot of different stuff. Most of the ones we care about: animals, fungi, plants. Slime molds are in there too because I am a big fan of slime molds. Technically they're in like Protista. They are not a fungi, but I will talk about them a little bit later. And here's another sort of split out of kingdom Eukarya. Here's the mushrooms, the slime molds are over here. And then this is the fungal tree of life. It's hard to see this whole figure, but I highly recommend you look it up because it's a beautiful illustration, and I'm currently writing a book on mushrooms, supposed to be sort of an intro book, and I'm hoping to use this as one of the main figures because it starts all the way down with like the basal lineages of fungi, which are sort of these little swimming aquatic parasitoids, and then it diverges out into some of the different like classes of fungi. Particularly up here is like basidiomycetes, which makes up most of the things we recognize as mushrooms, and then there's ascomycetes, which is sort of the other like weirder side of things that have the alien-looking fungi like truffles and cordyceps and morels and cup fungi and a lot of the lichens and stuff like that. So what are the sort of fundamental metabolic and lifestyle differences? Because people continually think that mushrooms are plants. And that's not an unreasonable assumption because up until about 1970, fungi were still classified as plants in like a biological taxonomic kind of way. But I want to just really like lay out some big differences. And also, just a warning, I'm going to get a little academic on you guys. Don't worry about the information I'm throwing at you. Just try to walk away with like the big picture stuff. And if you have questions afterwards, by all means, ask me. So plants are autotrophic. They are using light from the sun to build sugars and live their life. Fungi and animals are heterotrophic. So they're breaking down organic matter to make energy. Those are sort of big, different metabolic things. Plants do not break down organic matter to make food. Fungi do. And they used to think that fungi were plants that broke stuff down, and so there's words in the literature that are now sort of archaic because they were assuming that fungi were plants. They're not. From sort of an energetic perspective and like a structural perspective, cellulose is like the main structural carbohydrate that plants use. Wood is parallel things of cellulose linked together by lignin, gives a lot of strength. And then they tend to store all of their energy in starch. That sounds right, potatoes made of starch. Animals use chitin, which is another similar polysaccharide to cellulose, but it has a nitrogen in it, makes it a little bit stronger. We as humans don't use chitin, but arthropods, insects, all use, their exoskeleton is made of chitin, shellfish, etc. Fungi and animals tend to use a lot of mannose as a like kind of modifier of a lot of their stuff. So it's a structural and signaling component, analogous a little bit to like thinking about lignin in plants. And then animals and fungi store their energy in glycogen instead of starch. And so these are just some basic kind of biochemical things that are differences there to like, again, drive home that fungi are not plants. I don't know how many times I've had to say that, but that is, continually part of the discussion. So you may have heard prominent science personalities saying, humans and fungi are closer together than they are to plants. And you're like, yes, that is technically true. But just to point out to you guys, here's like the sort of like, advent of life. And this leek, I think, is like the last common ancestor thing. So this, I believe, is about like 1.7 billion years ago that like plants diverged from fungi and animals. And then about 500 million years later or so, fungi and animals diverged. So there's still like 1.5 billion years worth of evolution between fungi and animals. So while they are more closely related than they are to plants, they're still very different from each other. And I think that's one of the things that, just in the age of Last of Us and in the age of people sort of like parroting little science tidbits, it's important to remember that there's still been like well over 1 billion years worth of evolution between animals and fungi. So this, I really like this figure. It's a little confusing, but I'll try to explain it because I think it's fascinating. This is sort of like tracking the evolutionary history a little bit of fungi. And this is very complex, but basically what I want to show you guys is it started out as little flagellated swimmy things, which look a lot more like an animal, right? They're motile, they can even hunt things down. These still exist. They're called chytrids and chytrid mycota. There's a bunch of aquatic parasitoid type fungi. There's even some that have evolved to live like specifically in the guts of ruminants. They're a big part of how cows and stuff break down cellulose. There was a huge amount of these zygomycetes fungi, so the aquatic parasitoids, probably about 1 billion years ago or so, started coming to land with the advent of plants. Then they evolved in these sort of zygomycetes type forms. And that's essentially defined by they have spores that are able to swim around, whereas the mature version is more like a mold that grows into stuff. And a lot of these are work with plants, but a lot of them are like parasitic on plants as well. And there's all that green area kind of represents dead space. That was like evolutionary dead ends that were, ended. And then we have this sort of core of zygomycetes stuff. These would be like the glomeromycota, the arbuscular mycorrhizae. That's what I'm talking about when I mean zygomycetes. And then we have the advent of kingdom Dicaria. So there was ascomycetes and basidiomycetes. And these are the things we really care about because these are the ones that produce mushrooms and a lot of the other fungi that we kind of care about. And once those arrived, we got a lot more diversity happening in the world of fungi. And this thing is basically just to show you the periods of evolution where there's huge jumps in the amount of biodiversity and lots of different kinds of fungi evolving, often coincided with like massive die-off events. So when like an asteroid hit Earth and it killed most of the life on the planet, guess who had a party? Fungi. So they're like, oh, look at all this dead stuff, let's go. So they evolved a lot of new forms and new enzymes and new ways of breaking food down. And so that's where we've seen a lot of the bursts in fungal evolutionary activity. And so fungi taxonomy is complicated. And when writing this book, I got stuck for like about a month and a half trying to understand what the heck this was. And that's where my understanding kind of came back down to like, oh, there's basically sort of three basic classes of fungi. There's all those little aquatic microscopic parasitoid things, which you really don't need to worry about. And then there's other things like the Opisthosporidia, which is not even truly a fungi, but is classified in the same thing. And there's a bunch of stuff, like you can go all the way over to like slime molds and sort of say, well, all these things are sort of like fungi adjacent, but they don't quite meet the criteria based on like, do they have chitin, do they break stuff down, do they hunt their food versus absorbing it, etc. You can dive really deep into those things, but it's, frankly, they're microscopic and they're aquatic and they're not usually what we think about fungi being, but they're where fungi came from. So I think that's interesting to recognize. All the zygomycetes stuff is a lot of like Myrcomycota, and glomeromycota is now technically part of Myrcomycota as the new taxonomy is being defined. But these are things that live in soil, and again, generally microscopic. We don't pay a whole lot of attention to them. They do play a really important role in nature, and there's a lot of things that they do that we should possibly pay more attention to. I would also argue that when you hear people say like, oh, we've only discovered like 5% of all the fungi in the world, most of the ones we have left to discover are probably the zygomycetes. It's not like there's millions of kinds of mushrooms out there that we haven't seen before. It's mostly that there's like millions of kinds of microscopic fungi in soil that we haven't necessarily cataloged yet. And then there is kingdom Dicaria, and that's including Ascomycota and Basidiomycota, and those are the ones that produce mushrooms. So now we're going to kind of start getting closer to the mushroom stuff. So hang with me. So here's some of the basic fungal biology. I've sort of mentioned a couple of these things, but a mushroom there is composed of knotted together mycelium or hyphal threads, and so they kind of come together to form that mushroom. But if we go down, here's the hyphae, nice little like tubular cell. And then on the edge of the hyphae, you have this phospholipid bilayer full of proteins that are allowing nutrients to diffuse in and out. And then you have this cell wall composed of various layers of chitin and glycoproteins, lots of mannose, and that is providing a lot of strength and structure to the, and also dynamic ability to kind of adapt and interact with the environment, having that hard cell wall there. There's sort of three basic ecologies that fungi fall into. So there's saprotrophic, and that means something that is able to eat dead stuff, decompose dead stuff. There is parasitic, so something that can like attack something living. And there's what are called necrotrophs and biotrophs. So necrotrophs kill their hosts, biotrophs just tend to like live on it without, sometimes it can affect the fitness, but they don't generally kill the host. Usually as a parasite, does it behoove you to kill your host? No. I mean, again, that's the thing with like Last of Us, and I keep laughing at it. I'm just like, it doesn't make sense. The whole infection model of Last of Us doesn't make any sense because there's no way that something would become that pathogenic and try to like wipe out the entire race. It could be wiping out its food. That'd be dumb. Most of these fungal parasites tend to like exist in a population fairly cryptically at sort of like fairly low levels, and then maybe if there's a big shift in the environment, then they'll kind of spike. But they're not trying to kill their host because that would be stupid. You don't get rid of your food source. Oops. Go back one. And then I'm not even really going to address like mating and life cycle stuff because it is very complicated and fungi do a lot of different things, but I do want to point out that basically fungi can exist in both a diploid and a haploid state. So we are all diploids. We have 2 copies of our genomes. Our gametes, our eggs and sperm, have 1 copy of our genome. But can we live as an egg or a sperm? Not very, very long, and they're not, they're not thinking a lot. Whereas fungi can have like a completely separate life as the haploid form, and then come back and mate and form a diploid and then do something else interesting. So I think in that sense, like fungi are absolutely amazing and adaptable and weird in all the different sort of forms that they can take. So here's some of the key understandings I want to have you like take away from this talk, if nothing else. You have basidiomycetes, which are often referred to as like club fungi, and that's because basidia is this sort of like club-like structure with the spores on the end, and then that's usually what's hanging down like from the gill, and the spores are getting dispersed off into the wind. Ascomycetes, sac or cup fungi, often have their spores in what's called an ascus. For stuff like morels and cup fungi, it's usually a little needle-shaped sac filled with like 8 spores, and it's pressure sensitive. So if you've ever seen, I happened earlier when I pulled some of the elfin saddles out of the bag, they started just sporing everywhere, and I was like, oh my god. But if you take a morel and you blow on it, you find one of those little cup fungi. If you guys see like wood chip beds, especially, there'll be like sometimes big things of the Piziza, like little cup fungi. If you go down and blow on them, like 2-3 seconds later, there'll be a huge puff of spores that come off because they're pressure sensitive. So they're ready and like loaded to go off when they sense that little change in air pressure. So that's Basidiomycota, Ascomycota, kind of there. As I was talking about, many fungi can exist in 2 distinct stages. So they'll have that asexual, anamorphic, clonal, haploid stage versus the teleomorphic sexual stage. And just as an example of that, you guys may have all seen a witch's butter, one of those little like jelly fungi. Who's seen the videos of me fingering a jelly fungi? Yeah. That, for some reason, that has become my bread and butter of my social media, and it's very weird. It's very polarizing. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you go watch it and turn the volume all the way up. So witch's butter, that is the mushroom form of it, but in its asexual form, it's a yeast. It's a single-celled little yeast, and it blows my mind that it can live such vastly different lifestyles, but that's the way it evolved, and that's, fungi can do that. The other thing I want to talk about is there's a lot of hubbub out there about mycorrhizae. People being like, oh, trees are all like hugging underground and sharing nutrients, and nature's great, isn't it? And you're like, well, there's a little bit more competition and nuance to it than that, and mycelium is not exactly the internet. And what I want to point out is that something like 90% of plants on Earth have mycorrhizae. The other 10% of plants are legumes, and they recruit bacteria into little nodules to fix nitrogen for them. That's what my dad studies. But of those 90%, like 85% of those mycorrhizal associations are buscular mycorrhizae. So these are like Glomeromycota. This is the Zygomycetes fungi. They don't form mushrooms. They can form really big spores that sometimes you can almost see in the soil, but these are really important because they make up the majority of the mycorrhizal associations that plants have, and particularly in agriculture, when we're talking about like crops that we grow, that's pretty much all arbuscular mycorrhizae. And what that means is that they set up inside the plant cell. They form what's called an arbuscular, and it's essentially a little nutrient exchange tissue that the plant and the fungi are kind of going back and forth on exchanging stuff. Arbuscular mycorrhizae are particularly important for like phosphorus uptake, drought stress tolerance, and they lend some sort of positive associations to the plant because they're kind of working together. It's essentially ancient parasitism, where it was like a war of back and forth until they're eventually like, oh, we've been like fighting each other so long that now we're working together, basically. And then there's ectomycorrhizae, and this is what actually produces mushrooms. So this is chanterelles, porcini, amanitas. Most of the things that we really get excited about as edible mushrooms are often these mycorrhizal mushrooms. But that's only about like 3 or 4% of plants have ectomycorrhizal associations, and it's usually trees. So it does happen in ascomycetes and basidiomycetes, but those are the ones that we really care about. So just to point out, like majority of mycorrhizae, as we think about it, isn't actually producing mushrooms. It's the stuff that's just kind of on plants passively. And again, the point of mycorrhizae is essentially like coat the plant root in a lot of tiny hairs and vastly increase the surface area, so you can take up a lot more nutrients and water. That's the point of it. Okay, so diversity of fungi around the globe. it tends to mirror the diversity of other organisms. And so we have the highest amounts of biodiversity in often sort of subtropical areas. I know like the cloud forests of Ecuador are absolutely insane for the number of different kinds of fungi they find there. However, the size of those fungi is often very small, because if you're in a place where it's always wet and organic matter is always getting degraded, the mushrooms aren't going to have a whole lot of food to grow large. But they have a lot of competition, and there's a lot of speciation and niching down. So there's a lot of biodiversity in those places, but not necessarily large mushrooms. Here in the West Coast, we are renowned for having big porcini or big morels and things like that. And that's because we have those really distinct like wet and dry seasons, so there's a lot of time for the mycelium to grow through the substrate, absorb a lot of those nutrients, and then when it gets wet, they're like, ha-ha, I'm here. But you know, on the East Coast where it's wetter, they have sort of a longer wet season basically. Their mushrooms don't get as large. There's also more competition, more tree diversity. So as you can see, the West Coast of North America actually has a little bit more yellow on it rather than the West Coast, because they have more fungal diversity. If you've ever been out east and you've gone mushroom hunting and you're like, wow, there's more species of boletes than I can possibly count. And you go mushroom hunting here and you're like, I see like 3 boletes and that's it. It's because there's more tree species in general. And so more trees equals more associations. I'm not 100% confident on these numbers, but there's supposed to be something like, you know, over 32,000 basidiomycetes, over 110,000 ascomycetes. And as far as I can tell, there's probably something like 15,000 like recognized species of mushrooms, estimated to be maybe like 40, 50,000 species of mushrooms. And that's not new species of mushrooms we haven't discovered. It's more like every single fungi and mushroom we have here in California is probably a different version than the one that we have in Europe. And we just haven't necessarily described all of them by doing the sequencing. But a guy like Alan Rockefeller, who I mentioned earlier, is constantly sequencing new stuff. Although Alan isn't actually writing any of that up, because I asked him, I was like, hey Alan, how many new species have you discovered? He's like, 1. I was like, what do you mean, dude? You sequence things every day and you're constantly like finding new species. He's like, yeah, but I'm not like publishing on it, so no one's like describing these as new species. And I was like, oh, well, like, can we get someone to do that work? Is there anyone out there who wants to just take mushroom species and write papers about them to describe new species? If you're really nerdy, it sounds great. If you're not, well, it sounds like a lot of work. I have already done the PhD. I am not going back and doing more of that. No way. But I think it's wild because, you know, there's estimated to be like maybe 5 million, upwards of like 11 million species of different fungi. And a lot, like I said, a lot of those would be like the zygomycetes stuff that's down in the soil. But there's still, you know, we know something like 80 to 90% of all the plant and animal species on this planet, but we know closer to like 3 to 5% of the total fungal species. And that to me is just wild that we have so little idea. But it's partially because there's all that stuff that's hidden in the soil, and every time we like, you know, sequence a little cubic centimeter of soil, we discover like 20 new species. So you just keep doing that worldwide. Okay, so what is the role of fungi in nature? They are the primary carbon recyclers, and they really specialize in the breakdown and transformation of complex polysaccharides. So in general, bacteria are going to handle things that are like heavy protein. So if we die, most of our bodies is going to get degraded by bacteria, not fungi, which is why I think it's always interesting when people associate fungi with death, because there's very few mushrooms that have anything to do with dead bodies. And really what I see fungi is doing is taking like complex carbohydrates and transforming them into something that is more usable for them, but also more usable for everything else around them. It makes food much more nutritious and much more bioavailable. And I think that's important too when you think about fungi as like things that we use in food production. Turning grapes into wine makes it last much longer. Turning milk into cheese makes it more nutritious and last longer. Turning soybeans into miso or sake or tempeh or omkan, there's all of these foods, and the more we look at it, the more we think about it, you're like, even stuff like chocolate and coffee are fermented by yeast, by a fungi. Do you guys know that? Like, your chocolate and coffee wouldn't taste right if it wasn't fermented first. Cheers. So I call that sometimes the trophic transformation, because usually if you guys have heard of like trophic levels, you go from like algae to like small fish to bigger, you know, and every time you go up in one of those big trophic steps, you lose a lot of efficiency. And so what I see fungi do is instead of taking a big trophic step, you're instead kind of like drawing a diagonal line between different things. And the fungi are transforming those things into stuff that's more nutritious and more bioavailable. And they're one of their main roles in nature, is essentially doing that, kind of setting the table for everybody else. And that makes them a keystone species. So they're critically important for the sustainability of like particularly terrestrial ecosystems, but I've even seen there's a lot of aquatic in salt marshes and stuff like that. There's certain fungi, there's not a lot of them, but the ones that are there are very important because they take certain steps to allow everything else to kind of live its life. And fungi can be mutualistic. We talked about mycorrhizal associations, how they're helping plants, but they exist on a spectrum of opportunism. So they're always looking out for what's best for them. And you see this all the time. Plants do the same thing. If you take a field full of crops and they all are happily growing with their mycorrhizae and then fertilize the crap out of them, they often kick out the mycorrhizae because they're like, oh, we have all the nitrogen and phosphorus we need. We don't need you anymore. And you're affecting our fitness. So they kick the fungi out, but then they run out of all the nutrients and they don't have any mycorrhizae to help them resist drought or stress or whatever, and then your crop dies. And so you see this a lot too, where fungi will exist as sort of in parallel with something, and then an environmental condition shifts or nutrients shift, or even like another competitor comes in and the fungi before that was like mutualistic suddenly becomes parasitic. And so they exist always on this spectrum of sort of mutualism to parasitism, and I think that's another really interesting thing to think about. And then even if you start thinking about, well, maybe in its teleomorphic sexual stage, it's working with this thing, but maybe in its anamorphic stage, it's actually like a parasite of this thing. And so you kind of have to understand, like in nature, there's these big pools of all these different ecologies that are kind of all happening in parallel. It's complicated, it's cool, it's interesting. I find it fascinating. And like I was saying, they're sort of keystone species. So fungi, again, are pretty invisible. They're pretty cryptic. We don't walk out in the world and just see them all over the place, but they are all up in this room. There's fungi all over our bodies. There's a yeast called Tinea versicolor, which lives on our skin. It's what causes dandruff. If you get too much of it growing, you get dandruff. If you've seen people who have like the sort of skin lightening splotches, that's usually an overgrowth of Tinea versicolor. So there's a lot of different ways that fungi are out there. But one of the things I think is really important is because they are doing that initial step of taking inaccessible carbon and breaking it down to make it more accessible, they essentially set the table for absolutely every other form of life and allows them to facilitate the kind of community around them. So they are, if nothing else, they are community builders because they are allowing everyone else to kind of start their own succession and life cycle. And I just want to point out here that they exist as saprotrophs down in the leaf litter. They're mycorrhizal here, living on the roots of the tree. They can be endophytes living inside of the tree, kind of like the part of the inherent like tree microbiome. They're growing on wood. They're just all over the place, and like I said, all over us and inside of us, which is another one of those things that people who've watched Last of Us are suddenly like, oh, if the temperatures rise, fungi will live inside of us. I'm like, fungi already live inside of us. They're part of our microbiome. There's not that many of them compared to the number of bacteria, but again, the fact that they're there is allowing for all of the other kinds of diversity of bacteria to exist because fungi are kind of setting the table. So, okay, we're gonna stop doing all the academic stuff for the, oh no, I have one more academic slide, I take it back. But we're gonna talk a little bit about some of these mutualism things, and we'll talk some parasitism stuff. So, lichens, you guys have all seen lichen before. Did you know that's a fungus? The lichen is one of the most interesting forms of life on this planet to me, as it is composed of what's called a mycobiont. So there's sort of a fungal base species, and then there's a photobiont. So the mycobiont adopts like an algae or a cyanobacteria to do the photosynthesis for it together. So this is, again, the combination of fungi and plants. Not always plants necessarily, but so sort of a photosynthetic component with this fungal component. Fungal component provides the structure, provides the water carrying capacity, and then the photosynthetic thing is the one making the energy. Turns out there's also a plethora of different bacteria and other kinds of fungi that live inside a lichen. So lichen isn't just a combo of like 2 organisms, it's a combo of like upwards of like 15 all kind of living together. And that is just wild to me because you can chop and change those different components and pieces and get vastly different looking organisms, even though they're all sort of living this similar lifestyle. And we don't really understand lichens very well. Something like 90% of them tend to be ascomycetes, but there are a few basidiomycete lichens. There's actually a basidiomycete mushroom that is both a mushroom and a lichen. So in its sexual form, it's a mushroom, and its asexual form, it's a lichen, and that, mind-blowing. We talked about mycorrhizal relationships. It's a little simplification to sort of say the mushrooms and the trees are shaking hands, but they're generally working together. We have, as I mentioned, fungi all over us, so they're part of our gut and skin microbiome in particular. They are endophytic, and when I say that, I mean there are fungi that can live in between plant cells, inside of plant cells. They're often like the asexual form, the haploid form of a fungus. But they can also, they can be ascomycetes, basidiomycetes, some of the different zygomycetes fungi can all be endophytes. And those, like I said, those can be anywhere from being something that's mutualistic. You guys ever heard of the drug Taxol? Yeah. It's a cancer drug. Okay, so Taxol is a really interesting one. It's a drug that inhibits the actin tubule formation in cancer cells, but they originally isolated it from Pacific yew tree. And then they were like, well, we can't get enough of the Pacific yew tree to make enough of this drug. And so they looked into it a little bit deep and like, oh, it turns out the Taxol is actually produced by a fungus that living inside, an endophytic fungus living inside the yew tree. So they tried culturing that, didn't make any Taxol. And well, what's going on? So they looked a little bit closer and they found out that it was actually a bacteria antagonizing the fungi inside of the yew tree that made the Taxol. So now they've set this up as like an external system. They can produce this cancer drug. If anyone's ever heard the story about turkey tails curing cancer and that not being particularly true or arguably true, the drug that was applied in that situation that probably saved that person's mother was Taxol, which I think is a fascinating thing because that's a fungal-derived drug. So endophytes to me, if I could go back and do another PhD, I would go study endophytes. But you can't make me, and I'm not going to do another PhD. That was a long enough time in my life. So there's other great examples of mutualism. You have stuff like termites, which basically farm fungus. And again, the termites are going out and getting all this plant matter. They can't digest the plant matter, though, so they feed it to this fungus that they're actively farming inside their colonies, and that produces a lot of food for them. And leafcutter ants are a similar kind of thing. These are some of the most successful insects on the planet. They have massive colonies. They're all over South America and up into Central America. And they're some of the highest concentrations of biomass on Earth is in these leafcutter. And they leafcutter ants can take down an entire field of crops. They're not always good for humans, but they are essentially cultivating and have become codependent on a kind of fungus that they're farming to eat all their leaves, and then they eat all that mycelium, produces stuff for them. The termite mounds will occasionally produce massive mushrooms. I think in Africa, the leafcutter ants, mostly it's propagated through mycelium, and I think once in a blue moon they'll produce a mushroom, but it's pretty rare. So here's some different forms of fungal parasitism. You guys might have seen a reishi mushroom, Ganoderma, before. That's a white rot fungus, so that's growing parasitically on a tree, but they usually don't kill the tree. Honey mushrooms are super parasitic. They have these little rhizomorphs, weaponized mycelium, that'll run up underneath between the bark of the tree and girdle of the tree, cutting off the flow of the xylem, xylem and phloem. Those are necrotrophic because they kill their host. You have something like lobster mushrooms, which is a really cool, it's a base species of Russula lactarius that gets infected by this mold, Hypomyces lactiflorum. Turns here, it's usually Russula brevipes, so it's a boring white mushroom that gets covered in this bright orange-red mold, and it makes it a better edible mushroom in some sense. So it changes the entire gene expression and metabolism of the mushroom in the first couple centimeters of it, and if you cut a lobster mushroom, you can actually look at that layer. It's very cool. And what it does is it parasitically castrates the entire mushroom, so there's no more fertile gill surface for the base mushroom. Instead, the whole thing just becomes a factory-produced spores for the Hypomyces. And Hypomyces is also living asexually and sexually, so there's versions of it that are infecting the mushroom versus living in the soil, etc. Shrimp of the woods is a really interesting one. That is actually an Entoloma and an Armillaria honey mushroom species that are kind of going at it, and it forms these weird fungal galls. I don't think we really get those out here, but they're pretty interesting, and I've seen them out in the Midwest and on the East Coast. You have cordyceps, which are a kind of entomopathogenic fungi, so these are the kinds of things we saw in Last of Us. Cordyceps can do a lot of crazy stuff. We don't have a lot of cordyceps diversity here in North America. Most of it is down in South America, particularly those cloud forests of Ecuador I mentioned. Often they tend to be very, very specific to their insect host. There'll be one cordyceps species for one insect. On the East Coast, there is Cordyceps militaris, which I think can affect up to 50 different insect species. So it's sort of different from the rest of cordyceps. That's what that is. It doesn't infect a live insect and then do the zombie march. It usually just infects larvae that are down in the soil. But it does produce those beautiful little orangey mushrooms. And people have figured out how to cultivate those, and you can take them as supplements if you want to. I had a friend send me some the other day, and I cooked them up. They were very tasty. I liked them. This is Gibellula. So this is a little entomopathogenic fungi that attacks spiders. It's not technically considered a mushroom. And again, where we define what's a mushroom, what's not a mushroom, kind of up in the air. But this is another kind of fungus that attacks spiders, and there's a whole bunch of different ones that attack different kinds of insects. My friend Damon actually, like in his apartment, discovered an entomopathogenic fungi that attacks fruit flies. And then he brought it to his new house and kind of sprinkled some around. He's like, yeah, I want all the fruit flies. It doesn't kill all the fruit flies, but like if you can knock down the amount of fruit flies by like 25%, that sounds pretty good to me. I really want to take that stuff and stick it in a winery, because if you've ever been in a winery on harvest, there's just like stupid amounts of fruit flies. Yeah, sounds great. We have cedar apple rust, so that's a totally weird looking fungus. It affects apples too, but like it creates like a little dot on an apple leaf. You wouldn't think twice about it, but when it infects the cedar, it creates this huge, weird, jelly, muppety looking thing, which is super strange. Then we have stuff like corn smut, Eustalogomatus, which in Mexico is a culinary delicacy. People go way out of their way to get this thing and put it in tacos and enchiladas and soups and all sorts of stuff. It's absolutely delicious. And here in the United States, we spray billions of tons of fungicides every year to make sure that this doesn't happen, because they've deemed it bad. And it's just one of those things that kind of cracks me up. And I'm like, well, you know, this could be a great food source, but instead we've decided that this is bad. And, you know, again, this is taking corn, which is arguably like not the most nutritious food, and making it more nutritious by adding protein, by adding fiber. And instead we spray, you know, tons and tons of chemical fungicides to stop fungus like this from growing. Instead we could be cultivating it. You know, and I understand there's times you don't want it, but it's just interesting to me how we as humanity view like parasitism and what's bad versus what's good, all depending on context. So here's the last crazy academic slide I'm going to show you. And this is basically just trying to run down like all of the different like fungal ecologies and lifestyles I've mentioned. So we have saprotrophs, decay mushrooms. Oh, also this figure, just what it is, you can see the reference down here, but this is essentially like all the different forms of fungi broken up by like their different ecologies, broken up by, I can't even see the things on there, sorry, but basically like the bar on the right here speaks to like the diversity of each category and like what kinds of like lifestyles they're living. I just think it's a cool one. So the saprotrophs, things that are decay, there's lichens, which is the mycobiont, photobiont, you have algal parasitoids, those are your little swimmy parasitoid things, you have mycorrhizal mushrooms, or mycorrhizal fungi that are associating with the roots of plants, endophytes living inside the plant, biotrophs, which live in the live host, necrotrophs, which kill the host, mycoparasites, things that, you know, like the Hypomyces lactiflorum infecting a mushroom, microanimal parasites, so that's other aquatic parasitoids that can infect other tiny little swimmy plankton things. There's even, you know, you guys have maybe heard of like oyster mushrooms can like hunt and eat nematodes in wood. That's kind of a cool thing. There's a whole section of like little swimmy fungi that shoot like harpoon, like their spores, basically a harpoon. They can shoot it inside of something else, hit it, and like infect the thing with its own spores and turn it into like reproductive factory for that. So there's some weird things that fungi do. The entomopathogenic fungi, so the ones that infect insects, and there's a lot of like commensal fungi. We have a lot of commensal fungi inside of us. They don't just like hurt or help us, they're just kind of there. Some of those commensal fungi can then become parasitic. So if you've ever had a yeast infection, that's essentially like a commensal organism which has then become parasitic because it had an opportunity to grow. But there's, you know, millions more species to be discovered, and I just think it's so cool to like look at all these different ecologies and lifestyles. So let's actually get into mushrooms. I'm sorry I just berated you guys about like, you know, 45 minutes about fungi, but let's talk about mushrooms. So categorizing mushrooms, they're sort of the classic morphological approach. Look at gills, look at pores, look at ridges, teeth. You can look at all these different sort of cap types. You can break them down into like basic categories of you know, the basidiomycetes and ascomycetes. You can look at the things that are sort of gastroid, where the spores develop internally. You can look at certain things that are hypogeous or truffle-like fungi that live underground. You have some of the cups and the clubs and the, you know, weird pitted caps. Those are the ascos. Within basidiomycetes, you have a whole bunch of gill mushrooms. You also have boletes, which are cap and stem mushrooms that have little pores underneath. You have polypores, which are separate from boletes, even though they both have small pores. You have all these sort of claviloid mushrooms that produce coral-like structures and other little clubs. There's a lot of this stuff, but this is how mycology was traditionally defined, by looking at the way that things looked and then comparing their spores and trying to create categories of mushrooms based on how things looked in comparison to one another, and that's a classic biological approach. And it worked pretty well for plants and fungi, or plants and animals, but it failed spectacularly when it came to fungi, because fungi do a lot of convergent evolution, where they converge on the same form and function, but from different genetic lineages. So when we got into doing DNA sequencing, we had a huge, massive reorganization of fungal taxonomy. as many things, like all tooth mushrooms used to be, related to each other. And now we figured out that many of them are not related to each other at all. They've just converged in having teeth. Or many of the gilled mushrooms are not related to each other. Just because you have a gill doesn't mean you're related to something else that has a gill. You may have both evolved gills separately from different lineages. So there has been this like massive reorganization of things. And then, this is just, I like this figure because it kind of speaks to like the evolutionary progress of mushrooms a little bit. So down here is like the earliest evolutionary mushrooms. So if you look way, way back, you'll see that like jelly fungi and chanterelles are some of the most like early forms of mushrooms. And if you kind of think about like, well, this globular mushroom thing actually looks like an non-evolved version of a more evolved mushroom kind of thing. But chanterelles are also evolutionarily ancient. They've been around, longer than almost any other kind of mushroom, which I think is pretty cool because they're still awesome, right? And this, this is getting back to it, that idea of like, if you go through this, you can kind of look at how like different spore colors and spore types relate to the evolution of stuff. You can think about those like mass die-off events of when there was a huge bloom in fungal diversity, all that kind of thing. Okay, so let's look at some pretty pictures of mushrooms, because that's probably what you guys came for, not like a long academic lecture. So mushrooms can grow in a lot of different places, right? They can grow out of the ground, they can grow on wood, they can grow on other mushrooms, they can grow on insects. You'll find them in tropical climates, you'll find them in desert climates, you'll find them in cold climates. You can even find them underwater. There's a guy who found like a Satharella species that fruits underwater. That's crazy to me. How many people have heard of desert truffles? I had never heard of desert truffles, but as soon as I started teaching about people on mushrooms on the internet, there are people who come into my lives and be like, hey, I'm from Saudi Arabia, we harvest desert truffles. And I'm like, what the hell is that? So I Google it and I'm like, oh, there's such a thing as desert truffles. They're Tesservaria or something like that. They're like the size of a potato, the huge truffle thing. And they don't taste like truffles, but they're supposed to be pretty good. I think there's somebody in Israel who's trying to cultivate them. I was like, oh, that's awesome. So different cool ways mushrooms can grow. You guys have seen a fairy ring. It does not mean it's a portal to another dimension. It does not mean that's where the fairies live. Usually it means there's a circle of mycelium, and as it's growing out, the mushrooms are fruiting on the edge, and it's trying to grow its patch of mycelium. Rhizomorphs, I mentioned those. Honey mushrooms use rhizomorphs, so these are sort of like black, melanized, weaponized forms of mycelium that can creep up. They're very strong. They can resist desiccation. They can resist UV. There is sclerotia, which is another like blackened, hardened form of fungal stuff. Do you guys know what that is? A picture of chaga? Despite what someone out there may say, chaga is not a mushroom. It is in fact a sclerotia. The chaga mushroom, Inotus obliquus, actually does produce a mushroom, but it's like microscopic. It happens inside the tree. The sclerotia is something that forms on birch trees. It can grow upwards of like 70 to 80 years, reach a huge size. It is packed with a bunch of like antioxidants and melanin and all sorts of stuff, but it's sort of like a storage chamber for the fungi, and it tends to store a lot of lipids and carbohydrates in a sclerotia. And there's lots of other mushrooms that make sclerotia. Morels make sclerotia, even psilocybe. Like if you guys have seen the quote-unquote truffles in the Netherlands now, that's a sclerotia. So they're kind of growing it to the point where it thinks it's going to fruit, then they change the conditions and it forms this like hardened layer, and that's what they harvest and sell in the Netherlands. There is gravitropism. So that's like, this was essentially a log that was growing downwards. So as a bunch of turkey tails developed pointing down, and then someone shifted the log up, and all the new growth is now like parallel to the ground. So you see this, see this in a tree where it has a bunch of conchs on it, and then the tree falls over, and then the conchs start growing out, at a 90-degree angle from like where it was. So I think that's really cool. They can sense gravity. They're always orienting, so their spores are falling towards the ground. You have stuff like rose combing. So you see it all the time in chanterelles, hedgehogs. In there, I actually found a Lactarius yesterday that has like a cap growing upside down on top of the cap. So the cap's pointed down. There's another cap growing up like this. We don't really know why they do that, but they do. You can even find like double-decker mushrooms. That's a photo from Reddit. I wish I'd taken that one, but it's pretty cool. Porcini on a porcini. You have tiny mushrooms. There's clearly tinier mushrooms than that, but that's a good one. And you have massive mushrooms that can be almost the size of a human being. I think that's Macrocide titans. It's technically edible. Pretty cool. You have a lot of different interesting spore spreading strategies. So a great one that mushrooms use is be stinky. So stinkhorns are kind of mushrooms that they absolutely smell awful. They're full of ketones and other things that don't smell good, smell like rotting flesh, poo, etc. But they attract flies to come crawl over it. And they have this black sticky gleba, which is sort of like a spore-imbued thing the flies are like walking around in and eating, and the flies go off and find like a little piece of poo and like walk around in that, and the fungus spores are like, hey, we just got a bunch of nitrogen, like let's go ham. So that's a great way that they can work on spreading their spores. Truffles are a whole lifestyle of mushrooms that will recruit animals to come dig them up and disperse their spores by generating very strong aromas. So that's, you see this a lot in fungi, that they are actively recruiting animals to come mess around with them to help them spread their spores, which is why in the realm of like conservation, I think it's kind of like people keep assuming fungi are plants. They are not plants. Some fungi thrive on disturbance. So it might actually be a good thing that we as human beings are going out and mushroom hunting for them. In some like 30-year longitudinal studies, they basically saw that like human mushroom foraging activity in an area didn't seem to reduce the number of mushrooms. If anything, it actually slightly increased the number of mushrooms that showed up. So it doesn't mean that we should go out and wholesale harvest every single mushroom we find in the woods, but maybe if we're part of like a sustainable bit of nature, we can kind of replace some of the megafauna that came and messed around with mushrooms. And certainly if you've been out in the woods and you've seen like, I've seen a bear or something like chomp a matsutake, it wasn't worried about cut versus pluck. Animals are just out there screwing around with mushrooms, and it's all fine. They're doing great. Slugs are another great thing that comes and eats. Insects, all sorts of stuff is coming to help spread the spores around. You have stuff like cannonball fungi, which can literally like explode and shoot little like globules of spores on people's houses. You have stuff like puffballs and earth stars, where like it's a little ball of spores and the rain hits it and poofs out. Splash cups, like the bird's nest fungi, where it like raindrop falls in, splashes out little eggs, the peridioles, to spread spores all over. And you have stuff like these shaggy ink caps, which deliquesce, which literally like melting and turning into goop. So it's not dispersing its spores through the air, it's just melting and turning spores to goop. So I think that's kind of cool. And a lot of spores are dispersed by the wind, but here's just some alternative ways of doing business.
What's the time scale on that?
That was I want to say like 20 hours, something like that. It happens pretty quick. Like if you pick shaggy ink caps, you bring them home, and they'll go from like kind of turning like pink and then start turning black pretty quick. You can use that goop as ink or even as like a squid ink substitute. It's pretty cool. Next slide. Come on. All right. So here's some top tier edible wild mushrooms. We have our classic Cantharellus californicus. That is our state mushroom. We have a king bolete porcini, Boletus edulis. This is var grand edulis because it's up at Salt Point. Hedgehogs. These are great beginner mushrooms. They have little like teeth underneath. They're kind of pinky. Nothing else looks like those. They're very delicious and safe to harvest. Black trumpets. I don't think you guys get those down here because they're with tan oak, but those are phenomenally tasty, easy to identify edible mushrooms. Lion's mane. I heard yesterday on one of the forays there was some hericium around, so I know it can grow down here. I saw Stu Pickle, who I think is down here today. He picked a lion's mane like yesterday up in LA. Chicken of the woods, you actually probably would see a lot of that mushroom on eucalyptus down here. I do eat it off eucalyptus. I just cook it really, really well to try to blow off some of the stuff that's in there. Cauliflower, spiraceus is one of my favorites, and then like morels are top tier edible mushrooms. So these are all some of my favorites, and they're all fairly easy to ID. These don't really have like toxic lookalikes for the most part. Probably the hardest one or most ambiguous one would be the chanterelle. And that's usually the mushroom that most people start learning when they're mushroom hunting, which is funny to me because chanterelles are probably the hardest of all of these mushrooms to identify, but yet the most widely sought after in terms of beginner mushrooms. So here's a bunch of poisonous mushrooms. So I've got Amanita muscaria up here. Is this a poisonous mushroom? Yeah. Is it deadly poisonous? No. Is it edible? Yeah. Actually, you can straight up just cook about half a cap of Amanita muscaria and eat it. You're going to get a little sleepy, a little bit woozy, but it's not bad. It tastes pretty good. You can also double boil it and get all of the ibotenic acid out of it, which is the thing that can make you kind of sick. And then it's a great edible mushroom. There's a Chad Hyatt, who's an amazing mushroom chef, has like an Amanita muscaria ceviche recipe in his book. Fantastic. You can also dry it out and you make a tea with it. Some people use it as a muscimol, as sort of an entheogen that can like make you a little sleepy, a little tired. It's not like trippy in the way that people think that mushrooms are trippy. But I put it up here because Amanita muscaria is one of those things that is, both edible, toxic, and potentially a little bit, whatever, all in the same. Right beside it, though, are the Destroying Angel, Death Cap, and Funeral Bell. And so these are 3 deadly toxic mushrooms. These all contain amatoxins, which are little cyclic peptides which bind irreversibly to your RNA polymerase II in your liver and essentially shut down all liver function. And you don't get sick because it's a delayed onset sort of thing. It's really scary because you can get sick like 24, 48 hours later. You get really sick for a few days as your liver is shutting down and the rest of your body is like, ah. Then you get slightly better and then you die. And there's really not much they can do for you once you've had a really severe exposure to amatoxins. There's a few emerging therapies where they can kind of flush your system and maybe rescue a little bit of your enzymes to like maintain some liver function, but even still you're gonna have like permanent organ damage. So like, do not eat amanitas if you don't know what you're doing. And don't go out and forage little orangey mushrooms that grow on dead wood if you don't know what you're doing. So it's a really good idea to learn your poisonous mushrooms and be very, very respectful of them. Some other ones I see commonly around Napa and probably the rest of California would be that Paxillus, the roll rims. Those are big, chunky, really interesting mushrooms, but they're pretty toxic. They've been associated with some deaths in Europe. Jack-o'-lanterns, there's a bunch of those in there. Those are very toxic. They make you acutely toxic. You'll have several days of throwing up, diarrhea, severe GI distress. But they're also potentially like long-term carcinogenic. So I would be very cautious around jack-o'-lanterns, and I highly encourage people to like compare jack-o'-lanterns to chanterelles because they do not look alike. But if you read a description, you could easily get them confused. So always like look at photos, go to Facebook ID forums, use books. There's a lot of resources out there, iNaturalist included. Do not eat something unless you're absolutely positive what it is because you don't want to accidentally consume a jack-o'-lantern. You have the Gyrometra false morels. These contain monomethylhydrazine, which is a pretty gnarly neurotoxin. In theory, there's places in the world that like double boil these and still eat them. I just avoid Gyrometra in general. And then there's the one like toxic bolete. Most boletes are safe and or like non-toxic at least, even if they're unpalatable. Satan's bolete though has some protein in it that no matter how much you cook it can still kind of make you sick. So stay away from red pored mushrooms that stain really darkly blue. There is the liver bolete, which is a fairly similar looking mushroom, which is edible. You can tell them apart by looking at the reticulation on the stipe and paying attention to habitat. So there are also very vividly colorful mushrooms. Are any of these poisonous? No. People always assume that colorful means poisonous, right? And in fact, what I'd like to point out to you, what is the most colorful thing on this slide? Amnimuscaria. It's the least toxic mushroom on this slide. So often toxic mushrooms are not colorful. They're pretty bland looking. The Satan's bolete is pretty cool, but everything else is not super colorful. The really colorful stuff doesn't tend to be toxic, but it is really cool. So this top row of photos is from my friend Lee Ormsby up in New Zealand, because when I was in New Zealand, I didn't take pictures like this, nor did I find stuff this cool. But that blue entoloma is like the national mushroom of New Zealand. Some absolutely gorgeous little waxy caps and like mycenas. That Cortinarius is something that's called a sectoid, a pouch mushroom, so it's on its way to evolving into a truffle. Almost, have you guys ever heard of carcinization with like arthropods? Everything is evolving into the shape of a crab at some point, or like in arthropods, everything is evolving into a crab. This is a very efficient shape. In the world of mushrooms, everything eventually evolves into a truffle because truffles are a very useful way of living your life because you're not subject to like the environment around you, you're living underground, and you evolve a smell to get animals to come dig you up. So there's things that are halfway to evolving into a truffle, and that's like what this little pouch Cortinarius is. So it's halfway to being a truffle. So it's not really going to open up and have its gills exposed. It's going to just be that strange little purple pouch. And you see a lot of mushrooms like that in New Zealand. And there was some like theory that maybe these were like recruiting the giant sort of birds that used to live in New Zealand. There was sort of a cassowary ostrich type thing that lived in New Zealand. They thought that maybe these came along because this looked like one of the fruit that the bird would eat. So like, well, maybe these mushrooms evolved to look like that fruit so the bird would eat it and then poop it out in different locations. Pretty cool. These are a bunch of really beautiful coral fungi, Romaria, I saw at Salt Point. There's a little tiny green Lactarius. There's a bunch of Lactarius that turn green when they get old, but when they're super young, they're bright green. Absolutely beautiful, vibrant hygroscopy in New Hampshire. And this is Neoalbatrellus subceruleans. It's one of the sort of rare West Coast mushrooms. If you guys are familiar with FUNGUS, they have like a 20 rare mushrooms challenge, and that's one of them. I saw that up in Oregon. We have UV reactive and bioluminescent mushrooms. So there's Hyphiloma, sulfur tufts, Junopolis, Hemimycena, little Leptonia thing. So these are all, fluorescence is when you shine a UV light on something. There's compounds in the mushroom that have electrons that get really excited. So the electrons bounce up in energy state. As they come back down in energy state, they shoot out a wavelength of light that's different from what you shot in, and that's what we see as fluorescence. The bioluminescent mushrooms are like, we have omphallotus, the jack-o'-lanterns here. You can, if you go sit in a closet, I don't know if they'll do like 7 minutes in heaven with a piece of omphallotus, but you might be able to see it glow. Most of these are not bright enough for you to see with a naked eye. You have to do like a long exposure. But Pinella stipicus and omphallotus are both bright enough that if you sat in a dark room for 10 minutes, you can see them glow, and it's really cool. So that's a function of like a protein being cleaved, luciferin, luciferase kind of thing. It's not external light making it bright. It is producing its own light through the action of proteins. And we don't really know why that bioluminesce, but there's a theory that's been proposed. It's to help attract insects to help spread their spores. There is a whole world of mushroom aromas, and if you ever see Christian Schwartz giving a talk anywhere, go see his talk because he gives an awesome talk on mushroom aromas. But these are some of my favorites. Candy caps, Lactarius rubidus, produce this maple compound. It's a lactone called sotalon that smells very strongly of maple. It's literally the same thing that's in maple syrup and fenugreek and sherry. The Prince produces this almond thing, this benzaldehyde, kind of marzipan-y kind of flavor. Matsutake, absolutely amazing, kind of like cinnamon, seafood, chemical funk. Bluets smell like frozen orange juice concentrate, and not just frozen orange juice concentrate, but like freezer burn frozen orange juice concentrate. The cedar wax cap is kind of this Russian leather, weird like cedary, woody smell. The anise flavored clitosabe, really smelly, stinky squid, and then we have this phenolic yellow staining thing. So these are all stuff that you can smell, get a sense of. I have a feeling I'm way over time, so I'm going to finish off really quickly here by just showing you some absolutely gorgeous pictures of textures. My favorite fungal phenomenon, which is guttation. If you followed my account, you will see lots of pictures of this. It's mushroom sweat, basically. It's awesome. Another thing I absolutely love is all the microheterotrophic plants. So these are all things that are parasitic on fungi, mycelium, but maybe they're not truly parasites. They're actually helping to spread mycelium around. Look into those. I've done a lot of posts on them on my social media. Today is Sunday, so I really should have done a Slime Mold Sunday post, but I didn't have time, and this is sticking. Come on, go. I just want to show you one more thing. So question while I'm waiting for my computer to catch up. Has anyone here seen Last of Us? No. Yes. Okay, there's a few of you. Last of Us is a video game concept that got turned into an HBO show where a Ophiocordyceps species makes the jump to humans, and suddenly somehow within like a day and a half transforms most of the human race into these like vicious zombies which bite people and turn them into fungal zombies kind of thing. I have a slide on here debunking it, but for some reason, oh, there we go. Oh, okay, hang on. I just want to show you these slime molds real quick. Slime molds are not fungi, but they are protista, and they do all sorts of cool stuff like cytoplasmic streaming. This is me time-lapsing stuff, and you can see them kind of bouncing around. These you'll find down here. They're not going to be super common, but if you look at little like creeks and wet areas, you'll find them. Fungi are amazing. I'm not going to cover all the ways because we already talked about it, but just a really, really quick breakdown. For anyone who's worried about turning into a fungal zombie, don't worry, it's not going to happen. Global temperatures are going to lead to more pathogenic fungi. That is true, but there's still not going to be things that turn us into zombies. Fungi can infect and manipulate their host through psychoactive chemicals. That does happen in some of those entomopathogenic fungi. Look up Massospora. It's fascinating. They still are not going to turn us into zombies. Fungi are equipped with lots of bioactive compounds that help them overcome competition and resist rot. Yes, that is true. We isolated penicillin and lots of other antibiotics. Still, those things are not going to, we have antifungal drugs like azoles that can help us kill fungi. It's fine. They cannot survive if the host internal temperature is over 94 degrees. That is false. That's patently false. We're full of fungi. We're all over our skin. They're in our guts. It's fine. Does the increasing body temperatures lead to like more pathogenic fungi that can infect us? Yes. Still not going to turn us into zombies. We have no drugs. Again, we have azoles. We can fight them. Fungi evolve quickly and are extremely pathogenic and infectious and spread via contact with blood. No, none of that is true. Fungi grow very slowly. They evolve fairly slowly. They're not super pathogenic. If anything, they would turn like 10 to 15% of humans into slow-moving, lurching zombies who probably would just fall down and die and produce more spores. Anyhow, that's all I have to say. Thank you. Sorry for running over. And yeah, if you want to learn more from me, check out Fascinated by Fungi. Appreciate it. I'll be around at the fair if you want to come say hi.
Hi, everyone. We're going to change over to our next speaker. If you want to hang out, it's Chef Darren DeBerg.
Yeah, we did. I was just,
Just like you, it's early. We got to fill Korean.
Well, I know, that's why I was worried about going early, but it all worked out.
Yeah, you got a packed room.